Hey everyone, tonight we start with a group of crazy people who thought the North Atlantic was just a normal commute, the Vikings. So, before you get too comfortable, please like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here, and tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to see who from around the world is joining us. Now, turn down the lights and maybe turn on a fan for that soft background noise, and let's get ready for tonight's adventure together. Every Viking learned something different about sailing at first. It wasn't about being brave, finding their way, or how to swing an axe. It was chilly, a certain type of cold, the kind that gets into your bones, makes your teeth hurt, and makes you think that maybe raiding monasteries in the Mediterranean would have been a better job choice. The North Sea doesn't care about your dreams, your bravery, or your cool Viking tattoos. It's a graveyard that is freezing and has waves that look like bad choices. But for reasons only the gods and stubbornness know, the Vikings sailed right into it. Long ships built by the Vikings were amazing pieces of engineering, fast, smooth, and as comfortable as a coffin with an open door. There were no cabins, no insulation, and definitely no below deck. You stood still, hoping that the wind wouldn't break your beard. It was like camping. If camping meant getting hypothermia, frostbite, and maybe even seeing a sea monster, every wave hit, like an insult to me. The wind wasn't just chilly, it was a living thing that hated you in particular. In a matter of minutes, helmets froze over, beards turned into stalactites, and eyebrows froze into the same look of eternal regret. The ocean spray didn't splash, it stabbed, and there was no way to start a fire. You are now the world's first Viking flambe if you set fire to a tar-sealed ship. So they rode in the dark, cold, and without a clue as to why they were doing it. Thought this was a good way to live. The men put on heavy wool cloaks, which were like damp bath towels in the Middle Ages, and pretended they helped. When it was wet, wool smelled awful, which it always was. But it did hide the tears. They put straw on the deck to keep it warm, but insulation doesn't matter when your boat is basically a floating fridge. It was torture to sleep. The deck served as a bed, pillow, and personal ice sheet. You curled up next to 20 other frozen men. All of them smelled like fear and fish, and they all hoped that no one would roll over and take your only dry sock. There were times when the sea was calm, smooth, and quiet. That's when the real fear began. You'd look around and see that you couldn't feel your fingers, toes, or desire to live. But the Vikings kept sailing anyway, not because they were brave or fearless, but because they knew one eternal truth deep down. It was even worse to die of cold at sea, better than farming turnips in Norway after a long day of rowing through freezing hell. You might picture the Vikings going back to their warm cabins, lighting a small fire, and wrapping themselves in warm furs. You would be wrong. There were no cabins, no fires, and no cuddling, except for the time you passed out next to a guy named Harold who hadn't bathed since last spring. The Viking longship was a simple but amazing thing. A huge wooden freezer that looks like a car. The deck was clear, the wind was unstoppable, and everything Even you was wet. The North Sea didn't care if you were tired. It wanted you to be tired and a little dead. Sleeping arrangements were big, like a coffin. Each man had about half a meter of deck space, which was just enough room to lie flat if you didn't mind having a shield boss in your back. There were no blankets or mattresses. Only straw was spread out on the planks to soak up seawater and human despair. By morning, it had turned into a hard layer of Viking regret. Their beds were. Their cloaks, which were made of thick wool, were always wet and smelled like goats and defeat. Some people used sheepskins or furs, but those also froze solid, making every nap an archaeological experiment in pain. You didn't lie down to sleep. You talked to frostbite. The secret to staying alive was to wear layers. Vikings wrapped themselves up like people do with wool tunics, cloaks, and sometimes an extra pelt if they had stolen from someone who was richer and warmer. No matter how many layers they wore, the cold always got in, like an uninvited guest who came to dinner and brought pneumonia. To make matters worse, sleeping close to the edge of the ship meant getting a splash of salt water in the face now and then. If you slept in the middle, the morning rowing shift would walk all over you. There wasn't a good place, just a few that were a little less bad. And yet they managed to sleep, not comfortably, not warmly, but because they were so tired. Before their brains could remember they were dying of cold, their bodies shut down. Because on a Viking long ship, just because you slept well didn't mean you woke up feeling good. It just meant getting up. When your whole ship is made of wood, tar, and Viking pride, you learn to respect fire. One wrong spark, and congratulations. You have made the first bonfire that floats in the world. Vikings didn't light campfires on deck like normal crazy people. Instead, they used smoldering embers, which are less obvious. The crew members each carried what they called the sleeping fire, a small container made of metal or clay that is full, with the ashes covering coals that burn slowly. It didn't catch fire, it just glowed softly, like the last bit of hope on a cold winter morning. The embers were hidden under a clay pot or in an iron brazier, the Viking version of central heating. If central heating had a 50% chance of burning down your ship, losing those embers was a big deal. It meant no fire at camp, no food that was cooked, and no light to keep whatever creature was making that sound in the dark away. A good crewman could kept the coals burning for days by gently blowing into the ash when the glow started to fade. You weren't just steering a ship, you were also watching a fire. At night, men would gather around the fire, hold their hands out, and close their eyes halfway, acting like it was warm. It wasn't the truth. It didn't give off as much heat as a dying candle, but it was a symbol that fire still existed somewhere in this frozen purgatory. The embers weren't meant to be used for cooking. No one took that chance. People used to eat cold or smoked food long before leaving. The job of the brazier was only mental, a flicker of civilization in a world made only of wet wood and despair. In rough seas, the brazier would sometimes tip over, sending sparks flying through the air. After that, There were several minutes of screaming, frantic stomping, and heartfelt prayers to every god in the Norse pantheon. Most of them lived, which only made the Vikings believe even more that Odin personally protected fools. So, no, they didn't use clever engineering or roaring fires. They kept a tiny ember alive, which was the most fragile and annoying warmth imaginable. And somehow it worked, because that's what Vikings were best at. Take something small, risky, and not very useful, and call it new. The Vikings called it the sleeping fire, which was a poetic name for something that mostly didn't want to work. It wasn't a flame, it was a smolder, a slow, stubborn glow that was hidden under layers of ash. A little ember, small enough to hold in your hands and important enough to fight for. Over. It was a fire that was sleeping, and like every Viking on that ship, it was only one bad gust away from giving up. People treated the ember box like it was a sacred object. If you lost it, you would be humiliated, starve, and have to spend another long night pretending to like frozen fish. Crews protected it like people today protect their phone batteries. Obsessive, scared, and feeling like they had to do something. When the fire went out, spirits fell. That little glow is because your gods live in the sky and your feet live in ice water. Feels like the only thing that proves you're still alive. Someone was in charge of checking the ember box every morning. The unlucky person would crouch over it, blow softly, and hope the coals were still alive. If they didn't, good job. You are now the least liked person on the ship. There were no redosses. You'd have to start a new fire from scratch with flint, steel, and the little will to live you had left. It was about as easy to do that with frozen fingers and a moving deck as it is to put together IKEA furniture in a hurricane. When the ship finally made it to shore, the sleeping fire was woken up, stirred, fed, and brought back to life. The crew gathered around as if it were a god coming back. They'd cook meat, dry clothes, and sit in peaceful silence, all pretending they hadn't spent the last week fighting with a piece of metal and ash. Some sagas said that the Ember Keeper was a holy job, while others said it was a punishment. It was stressful either way. You weren't just carrying warmth, you were carrying everyone's. A jar of sanity, let it go, and you would have wanted the sea to take you first. No, then, the Vikings didn't have fireplaces or ways to heat their homes. There was one half-dead ember rattling around in a clay box, and men had faith that was too cold to ask why. The fire was sleeping, but it dreamed of better owners. Vikings had one rule when it came to clothes. Fashion is anything that keeps you alive. Don't worry about being elegant. This was fashion for survival. The North Sea didn't care if you looked brave. It cared if your internal organs froze before breakfast. Before breakfast, the organs froze. Every Viking outfit began with wool that was thick, itchy, and always wet. Wool tunics, trousers, socks, and cloaks. They lived in a sheep that could move. It held in air to keep warm, soaked up water like a sponge, and smelled like a wet farm animal because it was one. The Vikings didn't care. The smell kept both frostbite and people from getting too close. On top of that were animal skins, from deer, bears, seals, and reindeer. In short, anything that had ever moved faster than a Viking with. A group. The hides were thick and heavy, but they kept the wind out. Scholars now call the Viking sauna aesthetic the way furs lined cloaks and hoods. It was functional layering long before the North Face figured it out. The goal was clear: make as many things as you can between your skin and the end of the world. Some warriors wore more than one tunic, not because they wanted to look good, but because they didn't know how to do laundry yet. Boots were a whole different story. Viking shoes were more about ideas than comfort. Leather that is held together with cords and filled with dry grass or moss to keep warm. It worked better than I thought it would until the grass froze. Then every step became a game of how much pain you could hide while acting like you weren't afraid. Colors: dull, brown, gray, and maybe a little red if you just stole something from someone with good taste. Dyes were not needed and cost a lot. When your eyebrows were frozen together, no one cared about fashion criticism. Jewelry was their only luxury, though. Frost made rings, brooches, and armbands shine if you were going to die from the cold, you might as well look rich doing it. The sagas make them sound like tough gods of war, but most Vikings probably looked like tired lumberjacks wrapped in roadkill. Their clothes were soaked with sweat, seawater, and animal fat, and somehow that smell wasn't even the worst on the ship. But their crazy plan worked. The wind could cut, the sea could bite, and the gods could laugh, but the Vikings stayed alive. Yes, it was uncomfortable and dirty, but it was still alive. Which inn? The North Sea was the most fashionable place to be. The Vikings were most afraid of losing their feet to the cold. Fingers were not required. You could still swing a sword with a few missing, but toes were a big deal. No one wants to attack Paris with feet that break like old breadsticks. The North Sea wasn't meant for people to walk on. It was made to walk on dirt, not to stand in frozen puddles on a wooden deck while your boss yells poetry about honor. Ships from the Vikings were always wet from sea spray, melting ice, and the tears of men who knew this was their job. The end result: frostbite as a way of life. They made Viking socks to fight it. Not cotton, not wool, but grass. They stuffed dried sedge or moss into their shoes like natural insulation. You'd fill your boots, squeeze your feet in, and pray that they stayed dry for more than 10 minutes. It didn't happen very often, but at least it made you feel like you were doing something useful while you were freezing to death. The shoes were easy to put on. Leather wraps that are more like foot suggestions than shoes. You tied them tightly, said a prayer, and tried not to think about how you were basically walking on ice. Archaeologists have found Viking boots that look more like art projects than shoes. They sort of worked, but only to keep frostbite from happening until lunch. Some men put animal fat or tallow on their feet before putting on socks. The reasoning was good. Grease keeps water away. The ship now had the side effect of it smelled like a mix of dead seals and sadness. There was no relief, even at camp. You couldn't dry your boots by the fire. They would get smaller, bend, or catch fire. You just kept wearing them day and night until your toes went numb enough to stop complaining. But they marched, rode, and won because pain didn't stop the Vikings. They just changed the name to endurance. So, yes, they froze, limped, and sometimes lost a toe or two, but they also crossed oceans with nothing. But they only have grass in their boots, which is still better insulation than what's inside your gym shoes. A Viking longship looks sleek, elegant, and powerful at first glance, the very picture of naval power. Then you see that it's really just a popsicle stick with a hole in it. Yes, it was beautiful, but was it comfortable? No way. It was like calling a coffin a small apartment to call it home. Still, the long ship was a great example of practical design. Every bend, every, every plank and tar-sealed seam had the same job, to keep the boat from sinking. That alone was a kind of luxury in the North Sea, but warmth was extra. To keep the wind out, shipbuilders used a method called clinker construction, which involved overlapping planks and sealing every gap with tar and animal fat. It worked surprisingly well until the sea reminded you that tar only keeps water out, not cold. The ocean didn't have to leak inside. It reached through the wood and choked your soul. The Vikings hung their shields up to make things cozier on the sides of the ship. The sagas say this was for protection, but let's be honest, half the time it was to keep the wind from freezing their eyes. The ship became a kind of moving windbreak thanks to those round shields. It was like a floating burrito of misery wrapped in wood and frost. Some crews even used moss and straw to insulate their sleeping areas or between planks. For a while, it worked, but then it got wet, froze solid, and became part of the floor. Congratulations if you can get it off in the spring. You had come up with early Scandinavian flooring. The ship bent and groaned like a living thing when storms hit. Every board growing, every seam threatening to break. Men huddled together in the hull, shaking and praying that the engineering miracle below them didn't suddenly remember that it was made entirely of trees. The long ship was like a blanket, even though it had problems. A thin shield that creaked between man and nothingness. It didn't keep you warm, but it gave you something to hold on to while you pretended to die. That was enough for the Vikings. You didn't need comfort, you needed to build. You didn't need warmth, just hope. If your ship didn't catch fire, sink, or break in half, it was a warm night. The Vikings probably decided they needed shelter after getting frostbite for the third time. Not real shelter, though. Not walls, roofs, or anything fancy like that. They had a piece of canvas stretched over their heads so they could pretend the sky wasn't trying to kill them. It was called a ship tent, and it was about as useful as putting a napkin over a fire. It was made of rough wool or sailcloth and hung over the middle of the long ship, held in place by oars, shields, and pure delusion. It didn't stop the cold. It didn't stop the rain. It didn't stop hope, which was important for morale. 20 to 30 men huddled together under this makeshift tent, packed tighter than salted fish. They lay next to each other, wrapped in wet cloaks, and pretended to be asleep while slowly breathing in each other's breath. breath of each other, the air inside the tent was thick with water, sweat, and sadness. It wasn't because of the warmth that you lived through the night. It was because they were both warm and didn't want to lose. At times, condensation would form on the inside of the tent, and it would start to rain from inside. The Vikings called that kind of weather, the modern word for it would be a cry for help. But the real reason for the ship tent wasn't to keep people warm. It was a trick when you sleep on an open deck with ice. Even the faint shadow of a ceiling on your beard makes you feel like you're in civilization. It made a small mental gap between being outside and being in total despair. A gust of wind would rip the canvas loose every now and then, making it flap like the sails of a ghost ship. No one did anything to fix it. They sighed, accepted their fate, and added losing the tent again to the long list of bad things that happen in life. But even though it was falling apart, that piece of fabric made it look like a home, a weak barrier between the Vikings and the never-ending cold void. That's how the Vikings stayed alive. Not through comfort or luxury, but through the sheer stubbornness of acting like everything was fine when it wasn't. And it somehow worked. When you think of Viking feasts, you probably think of wood halls, roasted boars, and mead horns that are full to the brim. But forget that on a long ship. Dinner on the open sea was like punishment with food. The menu was always the same: cold, dry, and not sure. Cooking on the deck was not allowed. Fire and wooden ships didn't go well together unless you liked your food served with screaming. So every Viking voyage started with weeks of pre-cooked misery, smoked fish, salted meat, and hard bread that was tough enough to be armor. You were already halfway to Valhalla if you could chew it without hurting your teeth. We accidentally washed down our breakfast of dried herring with seawater. We had more dried herring for lunch. Dinner. Congratulations if you guessed dried herring. You might be able to live through the North Sea. People only got to eat fresh meat when their luck in hunting was better than their frostbite. If not, you chewed on your supplies and thought about fire. Vikings kept food in barrels that were sealed with tar, which made everything taste a little bit like ship. Butter, cheese, and grain all have that special seaworthy taste that makes them so good. They always got mold, so they just scraped it off and acted like it was seasoning. They ate a lot of fat to stay strong: whale fat, pork fat, and even melted animal fat spread on bread like margarine in the Middle Ages. It kept you warm and made you sick at the same time. Some sagas talk about sea porridge, which is a nice mix of oats, water, and regret. It was thick, tasteless, and could probably be used to fix a hole in the hull if it needed to be. It wasn't safe to drink water. They relied on ale or mead because it went bad in storage. Not strong enough to kill you, but strong enough to make you forget you were sitting in a floating freezer for a short time. Getting drunk a little bit to stay hydrated, the Viking way. And they didn't say anything bad about it, not out loud at least. Food was not fun, it was fuel. You ate because you had to row another 100 miles through sleep, not because you liked the salty notes of despair. So yes, they lived without warmth, comfort, or taste buds. When you're a Viking, Having a full stomach is a luxury, even if everything you eat tastes like shipwreck. The Vikings found the next best thing to fire for warmth. Me. Not because it worked, but because it made them care a lot less that it didn't. Me was the Vikings' answer to almost every problem. Cold, bored, scared, existential dread, and the sound of 20 men snoring at the same time. They drank about anything you could think of. It was sweet, strong, and deceptively happy, like drinking liquid courage made by someone with a head injury. It was made with honey, water, and wild yeast. It was wholly on land. In the sagas, warriors drank it as a toast to the gods before battle, saying that Odin himself drank the same thing in Valhalla. It worked better at sea. You didn't blow a horn to honor Thor. You drank straight from the barrel to forget that your boots were stuck to your feet. Wooden barrels were used to store mead, which was carefully sealed with tar and hope. As time went on, it got a unique taste that historians say tasted like the inside of a Viking. It wasn't about taste anyway. It was about acting like the warmth in your chest wasn't just your body. Giving up. A common myth is that drinking alcohol makes you feel warm. The Vikings believed it all the way. In reality, it just made your blood vessels bigger, so you thought you weren't freezing. It's the same kind of warming that happens just before frostbite. But good luck telling that to a group of berserkers who are half frozen and holding mugs. They didn't care. There was no science yet. Morale went up after a few cups. Men sang louder, laughed harder, and all of a sudden, the blizzard didn't seem so bad. They'd yell about honor and glory, and sometimes they would fall overboard. If the gods of the sea were kind, they would float. If not, at least they died with their hearts warm. The hangovers were heroic by morning. Salt wind, pounding heads, and dry mouths, the Vikings' three biggest regrets. But as soon as the next barrel opened, they forgot all about it. A cup of me isn't just a drink when the world is frozen and the gods are quiet. It's a small act of defiance against the cold. It might be an illusion that it's warm, but the Vikings drank it happily. When everything else failed, when the fire went out, the ME was empty, and the cold had crept into their souls. The Vikings turned to the oldest source of heat that people have ever known, to one another. Yes, that's right. The fourth Viking survival strategy was the old Scandinavian art of, please don't die next to me, I need your body heat. There was no personal space on long ships. It was either everyone's warmth or everyone's death. At night, the crew lay down next to each other under their wet wool cloaks, which made them all very unhappy. The sagas call this ship Brothers. Archaeologists say it is necessary. People today would probably call it trauma bonding. In either case, it worked. Each man was both a heater and a heater. If one person rolled over, the others stayed still. 10 curses followed someone who got up to pee. There was no privacy, just a mess of limbs, fur, and a crisis of existence. By morning, you couldn't tell where one Viking ended and another began, either physically or emotionally. It might sound strange to people who don't know what it is. It was Tuesday for the Vikings. Warmth was warmth, dignity be damned. They weren't cuddling because they liked each other. They were cuddling for the sake of thermodynamics. The only thing worse than the situation was having to explain it later. Their clothes even worked together. One man's cloak covered both bodies and kept air in, like a sleeping bag from the early Middle Ages. The smell was so strong that it could strip paint off a shield. It was a mix of sweat, salt, and despair. But that smell was the body's way of staying alive. Stubborn refusal to give up. And the thing is, it brought them together in both a real and a figurative way. Brotherhood didn't come from fighting. It was made while lying under a wet blanket and pretending to be asleep. After going through that much pain together, no one ever doubted loyalty again. The Vikings didn't talk about it a lot. You wouldn't either. But every story of bravery and every story of victory began here, with men who were half frozen, huddled together in the dark, sharing what little warmth they had left. They didn't just make it through the cold. They survived by becoming the fire they didn't have. It wasn't great. It wasn't brave, but it was hot. That was all they needed. There's only one thing to do when you can't feel your fingers, your feet, or your will to live. Begin to sing. The Vikings did just that. Music was more than just fun. It was a way to stay alive. When the deck of your ship was a frozen plank buffet and your beard was a place to collect icicles, singing kept the blood flowing and the craziness under control. Rhythm made warmth more stable. Harmony made misery less lonely. It was like Viking therapy, but without the couch and the skills to deal with things. The songs were easy. Chants, songs for rowing, and war songs. Each one was made to make 20 men pull O's in perfect sync while pretending their joints weren't getting hard. Some were about gods and glory, others were about beer and women, and some were probably about how much they hated being in this exact situation. The sagas never talked about sad sea shanties, but they must have been real. If you row across the Arctic in silence, you've already given up on happiness. These were working songs that were half melody and half grunting, and they were in time with the oars. The result was haunting, primal, and sometimes out of tune when someone's lips froze in the middle of a verse. The music wasn't just for fun, it brought the crew together. The same men who had fought over stolen food now sang together like a choir of freezing psychopaths. The singing drowned out the ship's groans, the wind's hiss, and the voice in your head saying, "You could have stayed home." And when the storms hit, when the sea howled and the sky turned black, they sang even louder. Not because it worked, but because it made them feel like they had a say in what happened. It's so stupid and beautiful that people shout into nature's chaos. The sound that says, if I'm going down, I'm doing it in key. Some people say the gods heard those songs. It's possible that they did. Or the sound might have just gotten lost in the wind. But that didn't matter to the Vikings. Singing kept the cold away, at least in spirit, because in a world where warmth was hard to come by, being defiant was the next best thing. And nothing fights the cold like a Viking chorus yelling into the storm. The Vikings were afraid of one thing that wasn't heroic, even though they worshipped gods who threw lightning bolts. Flame, not the kind that lights up a candle, the real deal, the kind that makes your ship, your home, and all of your crew into a Viking barbecue on the water. Fire was warm, but it was also dangerous. You could count on ice. Ice killed you slowly and politely. Flame, fire killed you in a loud way. Tar soaked every Viking ship, which was full of wood, rope, sails, and dreams. This is basically a list of things that the Norse people said not to set on fire. That's why long ships never had fires on board. No torches, no bonfires, and no romantic candlelight dinners for two warriors and a goat. Instead, they depended on smoldering embers, small, easy to handle, and only a little less suicidal. Setting a real fire in the middle of a voyage was the kind of thing that would make sure you were remembered in the sagas as a warning. It wasn't only about the ship. Fire was holy. At home, it lived in the hearth, where women cared for it, gods protected it, and people treated it with the same respect they give to Wi-Fi. The hearth fire was the center of life, cooking, warmth, and safety. Putting it out was a spiritual crime, like erasing your family's history, the past. But at sea, the flame didn't belong to anyone. It got crazy, dangerous, like a god let loose. The Vikings thought that was cool. They were afraid of it. They carried it in small ember boxes and whispered prayers that said, "Behave yourself, or we all die." Ironically, the one thing they tried to avoid the most was their funeral rituals. The famous pie on water was often the last trip of a warrior. A Viking would only set a ship on fire when he was about to die, because at that point, insurance rates didn't. It didn't matter. The flame was chaos for the living. It was freedom for the dead. The same thing that killed a careless sailor also took heroes to Valhalla. So yes, they were afraid of fire, but they also worshipped it, because in Viking logic, if something can kill you completely, it must be sacred, and if it kills you quickly, that's just good business. It wasn't Odin, Thor, or Freya that the Vikings really believed in. It was painful. The temples were for the Norse gods, but pain was for the people. It wasn't just a good thing to be able to endure. It was a way of life. You weren't a Viking if you complained. You were a bother. People in Scandinavia didn't trust comfort. Being warm made you weak. Being soft made you weak. And being weak made you French. Vikings learned from a young age that going through hard times makes you stronger, and by the time they were adults, they had enough character to get through freezing winds and friendships that were too emotionally distant. The sagas made it sound great. They would brag that he sailed through the snow with no clothes on and laughing. They didn't say that he was probably laughing because the nerves in his skin had died an hour before. Pain was a sign of strength. Cold weather was a sign of manhood. A Viking wasn't really alive until someone was trying to kill him. Their gods showed that. Odin gave up an eye to get wisdom. A wolf bit off Tyr's hand. Balder, the god of beauty, was even killed for the sake of the plot, so he could suffer and smile through it. That was heavenly. The gods didn't give comfort, they blessed strength. So the Vikings liked the cold as much as monks liked being quiet. With grim excitement and no other options, they made hard times seem romantic because it was all they had. Every trip that left you with frostbite became a way to worship. Every storm that came was a sermon. They howled back when the wind howled. They pushed through even when the sea froze. They didn't care when the gods didn't pay attention to them. That was normal for them. The gods didn't leave you just because you were in pain. That meant they were paying attention. New. People chase comfort like it's the answer to their problems. Warm homes, soft beds, and 12 kinds of tea. A Viking would say that was witchcraft. They didn't think that being happy meant having a lot of money. They measured it by how long you could row without crying. They might have been right in a strange way. Most civilizations prayed for safety, but the Vikings prayed for strength to face the cold and smile back at it. They didn't just put up with the weather, they changed into them. And if that's not religion, then nothing is. So, how did the Vikings stay warm without a fire after all the ice, wind, hunger, and bad decisions? The short answer is that they didn't. The long answer is that they were so arrogant that they cheated death. The Vikings didn't have warmth, they became it. They made endurance into energy, suffering into confidence, and cold into character. They didn't want to be comfortable, they wanted to be challenged. Fire was for people who were weak. Frostbite was just proof that you had been somewhere worth it. Boasting about. They put on furs, cloaks, and denial, and then called it strength. They huddled under wet canvas and sang into the wind as if being defiant made them warmer. It might have. Maybe that's why they lived while softer men stayed home and wrote poems about warmer places. They didn't have the right temperature, but they had a lot of conviction. Their hearts were like furnaces, fueled by pride, hunger, and a strong belief that they were the strongest people alive. And to be honest, they were. You try to row through storms in the Arctic while wearing wet wool underwear. They didn't need warmth to stay alive. They needed a reason to live. Every gust of wind, every frozen wave, and every terrible night on the open sea reminded them of who they were. People who are too stubborn to die the right way. Being afraid to freeze was cowardice. To keep rowing was brave. It was a miracle that they made it home. And when they finally got to land, with blisters on their feet, half frozen and half drunk, they didn't curse the cold. They said thank you. The ocean had put them to the test, and they had passed again. They thought that the gods had not spared them out of mercy. They had saved them because there was no one else who could do their job. That's the strange beauty of Viking warmth. It wasn't in fur or fire. It was in their songs, their bravery, and the way they laughed while nature tried to kill them for fun. Because when your world is made of ice and iron, you can't really feel warm. It's inside you, stubborn, on fire, and impossible to kill. And that's how. The Vikings didn't run away from the cold. They became colder than the cold itself. The Tudor church made itself look holy. On Sundays, incense curled through cold stone aisles, while sermons blasted against sin, gluttony, and lust. Priests stood in front of their flocks in clean clothes, their voices echoing words of purity. But when the candles were snuffed out and the prayers were over, that same church became a place of temptation. Not doctrine, but human flesh ruled the night. Rome imposed celibacy as an ideal, not as a natural state of being. The clergy were supposed to be married to God, but most of them couldn't help but touch the living. People in parishes from Canterbury to York heard rumors about priests who slept with housekeepers, monks who disappeared from the cloister after Compline, and nuns who didn't dream of Christ, but of physical warmth. Everyone knew, but no one said it out loud. Confessionals that were supposed to be for repentance turned into places for forbidden closeness. A young woman would kneel down and confess her dirty thoughts, but her priest would listen too closely and ask too many questions. "Do you think about him a lot?" he could ask, and she would softly answer, "Yes, Father." In the dark, both sinner and confessor became mirrors of temptation. It was ironic that holy men preached virtue during the day and whispered sins at night. For a lot of priests, desire was not rebellion, but a way to stay alive. Life in the parish was lonely, hard, and not very well paid. The church wanted people to be chaste, but it didn't give them any comfort or warmth beyond the cold company of doctrine. So they made excuses for their lust, saying it was a weakness that could be forgiven or even understood. One priest might say to himself, "God forgives the weakness of man," as he got ready for morning mass. But the contradiction only got worse. The church that burned heretics for small crimes put up with this quiet hypocrisy. It was not zeal that kept the clergy clean. They were afraid of getting caught, and that fear, too, became less sharp over time, replaced by familiarity. Ultimately, purity was just another show. Robes to cover up the body, incense to cover up the smell of sin, and sermons to keep the faithful from thinking about the sinful things that are going on under the altar cloth. It looked like the Tudor church was holy. It just didn't smell like that. In the English parishes of Tudor, the word housekeeper had two meanings. In an official capacity, she was the woman who cooked, cleaned, and took care of the priest's home. Not officially, she was his. Comfort during the long, lonely nights when the Bible didn't give much warmth. It was a scandal that everyone knew about, but no one talked about. From the bishop's palace to the village tavern, the faithful would nod politely to Mistress Joan or Goodwife Alice, pretending not to notice how the priest's so-called servant shared his bed and had children who looked a lot like him. The hypocrisy was almost like a government. Bishops find priests who are incontinent, but only when the rumors get too strong to ignore. Don't pay attention. Pay the fine, do penance, say a few prayers, and then go home to the same woman who is waiting by the fire. The church spoke out against lust from the pulpit, but as long as the money kept coming in and the scandal stayed small, they didn't mind it in the rectory. As one historian put it, the priests will sin, the bishops will sigh, and the people will forgive, for all have need of each other. Some of these relationships were very close, even like family. Some priests lived openly as husbands who aren't married. Their wives ran the parish as well as any vicar's wife did after the Reformation. Some, on the other hand, were more aggressive. Power and confession made for a dangerous closeness. A scared girl looking for spiritual help might find herself trapped by the man who was supposed to save her soul. A report from one bishop said with tired resignation that some priests take women in the name of service and make them concubines. Everyone understood it, even though it was written in Latin. Translation desire masked as duty. People in the village didn't often protest. It would be hard to kick out a priest they loved, who baptized their children and buried their dead because he was weak. And in a world full of sin and repentance, who was really without fault? As long as the sermons kept going and the bells rang for Mass, the appearance of holiness stayed strong. But the Tudor priest's double life thrived behind the altar. A life where sin felt holy, where confession was a way to get what you wanted, and where the church, no matter how much power it had, could never completely silence the heartbeat of human flesh under the cassock. Inside the stone walls of the Tudor monasteries, the fight between body and spirit happened every day and often ended before sunrise. Monks were supposed to be the church's soldiers of purity. They would get up before dawn, fast, chant, and avoid worldly pleasures. But people don't give up so easily, not even to God. In the quiet of the cloister, where the mind was supposed to, it often wandered off to memories of women, dreams of longing, and the soft smell of the world outside the walls, instead of focusing on the divine. For a lot of monks, temptation didn't come all at once. It was a slow process. The constant repetition of prayer and ritual dulled the senses and let the imagination go where it shouldn't. A beautiful pilgrim walks by the abbey gate, a young novice kneeling too close during vespers. Even small things like this could make you feel guilty and want something. A few monks admitted to seeing devils. Some people just said they had seen women. People were suspicious of both. Records from that time show surprising honesty. An abbot wrote in one visitation report that his brother confessed to sexual fantasies every night and begged for help with their bodies. Another person said that a monk had left the abbey for good to live with the widow of a brewer. Discipline was quick, but not very useful. A week of fasting, being humiliated in public, or a cold flogging could not fix what had been going on for hundreds of years. Had not put out. The irony was mean. The more a man was told to deny who he was, the more it haunted him. Some monks turned their guilt into extreme devotion, punishing their bodies to quiet the voice of desire. Some people got angry and made fun of their vows in private. They drank beer behind the garden wall and snuck out to nearby villages at night. The church said it was weak. They called it staying alive. The Reformation of Henry VIII showed how human these people were by breaking up the monasteries. Men of God. Inspectors found lovers, children born out of wedlock, and hidden caches of gold and ale. The monasteries that used to hide the fight between flesh and faith were laid bare. England learned that even the most holy robes couldn't hide the oldest sin of all, the desire to be touched, to be loved, to be human. The confessional, a small wooden box where people were supposed to confess their sins, was often the Tudor Church's most private place for temptation. Theoretically, It was holy ground. A priest. There was a penitent on one side and a veil of secrecy between them. But, like silence, keeping things secret can be dangerous. It was very easy for many priests to cross the line between spiritual guidance and personal curiosity, especially since they were already dealing with their own forbidden desires. A confession could start out as something simple. A young woman whispered that she had bad thoughts about a man, maybe her husband's friend, or maybe the priest himself. The priest would ask for more information, demanding that full honesty was necessary for forgiveness. She would blush as she did what he said, not knowing that every word she said made the priest's own forbidden imagination run wild. He might tell her to pray for purity, or he might hold on to the memory for a long time after she left, holding his rosary like a lifeline against desire. There are stories of confessors who took advantage of this holy privacy. Some people used their power to control scared women, promising to forgive them in exchange for favors that could never happen. Be said out loud. Some people convinced themselves they were helping by saying that to understand sin, you had to experience it. It was self-delusion in holy language, with lust wearing a halo. Bishops sometimes got complaints, but most of the time they just sighed and moved on. The sin was too common, and the system was too weak to show it. Confession could be hard, even for people who were innocent. Priests who were trained to get sin out of every soul found that their own minds were the hardest places to fight. Hearing hundreds of whispered, their imaginations were full of sins they hadn't done, but now they couldn't stop thinking about them. One historian said that priests came out of the confessional angrier than the people they had just forgiven, and still, no one questioned this ritual. People still knelt, priests still listened, and behind the screen, human weakness met divine expectation. The purpose of the confessional was to get rid of sin, but for many Tuda priests, it just recycled it, changing shame into desire, and guilt turned into longing again. The church's silent blessing kept the circle of hypocrisy going around and around. Women who vowed to serve only God behind convent walls often found their own secret ways to love. The Tuda nuns were supposed to be Christ's brides, pure, obedient, and cut off from the world. But convents weren't always as quiet or holy as sermons said they were. They were groups of young women, and many of them went there not out of devotion, but because it was easy. A family might keep an unruly person in a small room, daughter or hide away a pregnancy that isn't convenient. And once the gates closed behind them, the fight between faith and body began. The first thing that came in was loneliness. The daily routine of prayers, fasting, and chores made the mind dull. During hymn practice, eyes stayed on the face of a fellow sister for too long, or on the visiting priest who heard confessions with kind patience. In such a small world, love quickly turned into danger. People snuck letters through kitchens and courtyards. A nun might say she was going to the garden to pick herbs. But the real harvest was waiting for her behind the wall. Historical records, even though they were written with moral outrage, show hints of forbidden love. One report from a visit said that two nuns were found in very unholy embraces. Another person talked about whisperings at midnight and feelings of love that went beyond sisterhood. The punishments were embarrassing and included fasting, public confession, or being locked up. But none of it changed the pattern. For some, the convent was not a prison. It was a place where love could hide, out in the open under the language of devotion. And there were people whose sins were much more dangerous. Some nuns had affairs with monks or priests who came to visit. Some of them even got pregnant, and their swollen bellies were blamed on dropsy or a miraculous illness. People usually buried the shame for real. A sick room, a quiet death, and a quick burial under the stones of the cloister. It seemed that God's mercy came faster when the church was quiet. But there was something very human behind the hypocrisy. These women were not bad guys. In the first place, they weren't allowed to be human. The vows they made were like cages made of obedience and loneliness. It wasn't just lust that made them break them. It was a revolt against a system that didn't allow love. The Tuda nuns lived the one truth the church tried hardest to hide, that desire blooms even on holy ground. They made secret promises and whispered sweet nothings to each other. There was no love in a Tuda convent, at least not the kind that lives on earth. But inside the dim, hearts rebelled in the candlelight of these walled-off places. The rules were clear. Obey the abbey, be quiet after vespers, and be pure above all else. But the heart doesn't know canon law. The convent was built to keep people from giving in to temptation. Instead, it became a place for it to grow. You can't kill desire by locking away youth, beauty, and longing behind stone and prayer. It gets better. Letters from that time talk about both sad and sweet scenes. One sister sent a letter to a monk at a nearby abbey. I see you. I only pray for you, but my prayers are full of you. Someone got the letter, and her punishment was harsh. A week of fasting and public shame, but even after she repented, she still loved him, though she hid it behind hymns and daily penance. Later, she would carve a small heart under the wooden bench of her choir stool. It was the closest thing she had to a love letter that would last. People who came to the convent from outside only made it harder to resist. Merchants, stonemasons, and confessors came through the gates to tell people about the world beyond. For young women who had been kept away from the world since they were kids, a kind smile or soft word could feel like heaven. Some priests took advantage of that ore. A confessor might stay too long after hearing sins, giving comfort that quickly crossed the line of what was holy. A chronicle from 1538 tells the story of a priest who was caught sneaking into a convent at night while pretending to be a pilgrim. Exile was his punishment, even though everyone knew it wasn't the first time he had done something wrong. This crisis only got worse with the Reformation. As royal inspectors started to close down monasteries and convents, they found out what polite society had long suspected. Nuns who had children, lovers who wrote letters, and hidden doors that led from cloisters to nearby parsonages. Henry VIII's agents, who wanted to make Catholic orders look bad, wrote down every scandal they could find. One report coldly said, "In the convent of Godtow, more babies were born than psalms were sung, but even in the middle of all this chaos, not everything was bad." Some of these forbidden romances were real, with two souls clinging to each other in defiance of a system that denied them affection. It wasn't just lust that thrived behind those walls. It was a quiet, desperate desire for love, friendship, and freedom, three things the church itself had told them they couldn't look for. When Henry VIII broke away from Rome, the Church of England was born not out of holiness, but out of lust, and the hypocrisy was too much to ignore. Here was a king asking for spiritual independence so he could divorce his wife and marry another, while his bishops preached chastity from gilded pulpits. The Reformation wasn't just a political revolution, it was a huge unmasking of clerical sin. Suddenly, the same men who had condemned others for being impure found themselves stripped of their own illusions of virtue. Royal inspectors sent to close monasteries, and convents found scandal after scandal. They reported monks living with wives, priests having children, and nuns whose miraculous illnesses turned out to be pregnancies. Of course, Henry's agents exaggerated. Every sin they found served as justification to seize more church property, but the seeds of truth were undeniable. The 2DA clergy had been preaching against temptation while drowning in it. Lust, it seemed, had done more damage to Rome's authority than any sermon could. The hypocrisy extended from the pulpit to the throne. Henry himself justified his affairs by invoking divine will, declaring that God wanted him to have a male heir, no matter how many wives or mistresses it took. Courtiers took the hint. Bishops blessed the king's unions, and annulments with rehearsed piety, each one pretending that Scripture somehow agreed. Behind the mask of reform was a court obsessed with pleasure, gossip, and power, draped in the thin veil of religious duty. Common folk watched all this with weary amusement. The village priest still kept his housekeeper. The abbey walls still whispered with desire. Only now the crown, not the pope, collected the confessions. The Reformation didn't purge lust from the church. It nationalized it. The same men who once whispered Latin prayers now toasted English queens, swapping faith for favor, robes for gold, and vows for politics. In the end, Henry's break with Rome revealed what everyone had always known, but few dared to say that the Tudor Church's greatest sin wasn't lust itself, but the denial of it. For centuries, desire had been the secret heartbeat beneath the hymns, and when the Reformation came, it simply tore off the cassock, exposing the flesh that had always been there, trembling beneath the illusion of divine control. After Henry broke away from Rome, the pulpits of England were filled with new authority. Priests, who were now loyal to the crown instead of the pope, preached a purer, holier faith. But for all the talk of reform, the sermons still smelled faintly of hypocrisy and sometimes of perfume. The men who spoke out against Catholic corruption often carried their own brand of temptation under their robes. The cassock may have changed allegiance, but not appetite. Many clergy took advantage of their newfound freedom to live more openly, no longer hiding their lovers by calling them housekeepers. At one point, priests were not allowed to marry, but now they could. But it's hard to break old habits. Some men married, but still looked for pleasure in other places. Others, inspired by reform, made their sermons into shows of moral superiority, telling their congregations not to do the same things they did in private. The louder a man preached about being pure, the more likely it was that he was hiding something. There are a lot of these kinds of contradictions in parish court records. One minister was fined for having sex with several women in his church who were not his wife. Another was caught in bed with the wife of a church warden. Bishops were not immune either. People said that the Bishop of Gloucester was keeping a concubine as a lairess in 1551. The irony was almost heavenly. The church had split from Rome in search of moral clarity, but it ended up saying the same old things, only in English this time. But the people weren't fooled. They made fun of the clergy in a bitterly funny way in taverns and markets. One ballad joked that the parson preaches hellfire, but sleeps in a warm bed. There were satirical plays that made fun of lecherous friars and hypocritical preachers, and pamphlets with pictures of priests caught in scandalous embraces. The Reformation, which was supposed to purify the faith, instead made sin into a form of entertainment. Still, the church survived, its priests were forgiven, and its followers accepted it. Desire had shown itself to be stronger than dogma and longer lasting than any law. Even though sermons were going on about temptation, the pulpit itself became a monument to it. For every moral command, there was an unspoken confession that holiness and hunger were never enemies, only uneasy friends. The Tudor church had not gotten rid of lust. It had just learned to preach over it, louder, longer, and with better lighting. By the end of the Tudor years, lust and holiness had learned to live together, even though it was hard. The church had changed its robes, rewritten its prayers, and hidden its scandals under new laws. But human nature would not. Follow theology, the ghost of temptation was still there behind every sermon on purity. Even the most holy clergyman standing in front of his flock in a candlelit church had the same inner struggle that monks, priests, and nuns had before him. The pull between the body and the faith. The irony was almost like poetry. The Reformation had promised a church that was free of corruption and a moral cleansing of England's soul. But in reality, it just moved the sin from confessionals to courts and from monasteries to royal rooms. Lust had not been beaten. It had been spread out again. The crown got married and divorced. Courtiers traded favors in bedrooms just as easily as they did in council halls, and priests still struggled with the very desires they condemned. The Tudor age, which was very concerned with sin, was also one of the best places for it to grow. But this fight made the time unique in its own way. The Tudor clergy, despite their hypocrisy, embodied the same contradictions present in every believer. They wanted to be. They wanted to be loved, but they also wanted to be pure. They preached about eternal salvation, but they wanted the warmth of life. The robes and ceremonies could hide desire, but they couldn't get rid of it. So the church, with all its beauty and guilt, became a reflection of England itself. Proud, religious, and always tempted, Elizabeth I, the last Tudor queen, was the perfect example of this balance when she became queen. People talked a lot about the Virgin Queen's lovers while she was in charge of the country. There was a lot of poetry and passion in her courts. Her priests preached restraint, while singers sang of desire. Holiness had turned into a play, and the audience loved every act. The secret desires of the Tudor Church were not just sins in the end, they were signs that you were human. Underneath the hymns, the robes, and the fear of eternal fire, there was the same unchanging truth. That desire, even though it was wrong, was part of creation itself. And even though priests might burn for it, kings change for it, and the faithful confess it. Lust was still England's true religion, the one faith that the TUDA, the church, could never fully use. The ancient Silk Road was alive with the slow, steady shuffle of camel hooves long before engines roared or trains clanged. It wasn't just one road, it was a huge network of roads, a web of dirt and dust that ran from China's big cities to the Mediterranean's sparkling ports. Spices, jade, and silk went west. Gold, glass, and stories went east. But none of it would have been possible without one important invention. The caravanserai, the fortress of the traveler. Think about walking through the Gobi Desert for days. The wind hurts your lips, and the sand eats all the noise. You can see it on the horizon, thick stone walls rising up from the empty space, a gate with a torch that promised food, safety, and friends. When you went into a caravanserai, you were safe. It was a safe place for the merchant. It was a place for the monk to preach. The spy had a chance to listen. Every caravanserai was more than just a place to rest. It was a small world inside of. Walls. They were built about 30 to 40 kilometers apart, which is about a day's walk, and they made up the spine of the Silk Road. The buildings said something about both function and culture. Heavy gates to keep out raiders, wide inner courtyards for caravans, fountains to wash off desert dust, and prayer halls for tired souls. While stable hands took care of the camels and horses, their bells ringing softly all night, guards watched the gates. The architecture wasn't what made these places special, though. It was the people that filled them. Persian poets and Chinese scholars exchanged verses. Turkish nomads and Venetian merchants fought over bolts of silk. Languages clashed, religions mixed, and recipes, maps, and rumors spread from person to person. The caravanserai was a meeting place for different cultures, partly a market, partly a university, and partly a whisper network. Globalization was born here not out of desire, but out of need, from the shared struggle to survive deserts, mountains, and men. The silk. Not only did the roads shine with gold and silk, but also with the ideas that traveled from one firelit courtyard to another. Every caravanserai was like a heart beating quietly and faithfully, keeping the lifeblood of the ancient world moving between east and west. Each caravanserai was like a stubborn island in a sea of dust, a fortress of hospitality in a vast wilderness. These roadside inns were built for the same reason, to keep people and businesses safe. No matter where a traveler came from, seeing high walls and a heavy wooden gate meant safety, warmth, and food that wasn't dried camel jerky. Caravans were architectural marvels. Most of them had one big gate that closed at sunset. No one could come in or out until dawn after it was closed. Inside was a large courtyard where merchants unloaded their goods, such as bales of silk, clay jars of spices, sacks of saffron, and cages full of parrots from India or falcons from Arabia. There were rows of arched rooms along the walls. Some were used as sleeping quarters, and others were used as stables. The main fountain or well gave water to both people and animals. Its sound mixed with the sound of hooves and the sound of many languages. The design showed both usefulness and strength. Caravans that traveled along Persian routes were often fortified and served as military bases. In Ottoman lands, sultans built huge stone khans that looked more like castles than inns. These were signs of royal protection for trade. Even the Mongols, who were great at traveling across open land, built way stations where silk caravans could stop and rest under guard. They knew that peace on the road meant more money for everyone, but inside, the air was electric, even beyond the walls and gates. Every caravanserai became a tiny city at night. Merchants looked at prices by torchlight. Musicians played lutes, and storytellers told long stories about gods and kings to traders who were half asleep on rugs. Here, a Chinese Buddhist and an Armenian could drink tea together. A Persian poet and a Syrian monk were arguing about the Bible while a jeweler worked. Languages clashed, and so did ideas, artistic, religious, and scientific. These inns were more than just buildings. They were the engines of civilization. Every caravanserai was a small part of the larger web of human exchange, a point of connection between worlds that would never meet. Globalization wasn't a new idea behind those thick, dirty walls. It was a nightly routine that was based on spice, stories, and survival. The caravan moved before dawn. Bells. As torches flickered against the walls of the caravan, men shouted in a dozen different languages, camels groaned, and the bells rang. The merchants on the Silk Road were the highway's lifeblood. They were a restless group of traders, dreamers, and gamblers who risked everything for the chance to make money and gain respect. They came from all over the world, including China, India, Persia, Arabia, and the Mediterranean. Some of them had silk and porcelain. Some people sold gold, wool, or glass. Their faith or where they came from did not bring them together. The road that never ends. A normal caravan could have hundreds of animals and dozens of men. Camels were like ships in the desert. They were slow, stinky, and necessary. Horses carried couriers, donkeys carried smaller loads, and guards rode on the sides with curved sabers that shone in the morning light. Every merchant had a job to do. The leader or caravan bashi set the pace and settled disagreements. Scribes wrote down transactions in a careful way, and cooks made flatbread, stew, and dried fruit for everyone to eat. Traveling the Silk Road meant living as one person, connected by trade and trust, while safe in a caravan. Sarai, traders who are rivals might eat together, tell stories, or make a deal that would affect people all over the world. A Persian spice dealer might sell cardamom to an Italian merchant, who would then take it by ship to Venice. There, nobles would sprinkle it on their feasts to show off their wealth. A Chinese silk master might trade bolts of embroidered fabric for Arabian glassware that is delicate, shimmery, and sought after back home. In this way, whole economies depended on these nightly trades under foreign stars. But it was dangerous to travel. There were bandits in the mountain passes. Sandstorms wiped out whole convoys, and people got sick without warning. Caravans arise were the thin line between life and death. Getting to one by nightfall was a win. Not going meant risking death. So every merchant's map had not only routes, but also the names of safe havens where they could find shelter, warmth, and gossip. For these traders, the road was more than just business. It was meant to be. They were the highways of the ancient world, moving goods, gossip, and gods across deserts and empires. Each caravanserai was like a heartbeat, pulsing, echoing, and keeping civilization alive, one tired step at a time. The caravan was the opposite of the quiet desert. A storm of voices, laughter, and rumors echoed through the night. During the day, it was a stronghold, a world parliament at night. Traders, monks, messengers, and travelers gathered around fires to trade not just goods, but also secrets. A caravanserai was a place where people could trade information and talk about the fates of empires over a bowl of lentil stew. It was faster to get news here than on any royal road. A trader from Samarkand might come to say that the Khan of the East was raising taxes. A Persian courier would say that the Ottoman Sultan was getting ready for war. A monk from India might talk about a new group, and a trader from Venice might say that silver prices had gone down across the sea. The story was half true and half made up, and everyone who heard it became both a student and a spy. When there were no newspapers, caravans were the world's wireless network. Dirty, loud, and completely necessary. The gossip didn't just stop at politics. There were stories of bandits and ghosts that haunted some passes, caravans that got lost in the dunes, kings who paid in pearls, and emperors who collected mechanical birds. The merchants took these stories west, and the monks took them east, mixing with legend until what was once a rumor became history. There was even mileage in myths. A traveler could leave China hearing about dragons and arrive in Persia thinking they had seen one. For a lot of people, the gossip was worth more than the trade itself. Monks learned about shrines and relics that were far away. Explorers picked up clues about new lands. Rulers sent spies who pretended to be merchants to listen and tell them what they heard. A well-placed rumor could ruin a competitor's business or bring people together. The innkeeper, who was often ignored, became the gatekeeper of this hidden empire. His ears were sharper than any sword, and his memory was more dangerous than any army. But there was something deeper than all the talking, a connection. Enemies could eat from the same pot, Christians could drink wine with Muslims, and Buddhists could trade blessings for salt at the caravanserai. The lines between empires faded in the flickering light of the lamp, leaving behind a truth that all travelers understood. The road was long, the world was big, and you needed to trade and trust to stay alive. Long before merchants brought silk to Rome or spices to Venice, monks brought something that would last even longer: ideas. Along the Silk Road, the caravans turned into strange monasteries where people of different faiths met, mixed, and sometimes fought. Under the same roof, you could find a Buddhist monk from Nanda, a Neosteran priest from Mesopotamia, a Sufi mystic from Persia, and a Taoist scholar on a pilgrimage. They came by camel, on foot, or in carts pulled by oxen. They were not traders, but people who had seen something. The road was their holy book. Every night, their prayers rose together in a dozen languages, each one a verse. In these shared courtyards, people argued not about gold or silk, but about the soul. The Buddhist monk talked about being kind and not getting too attached, the Christian priest of grace and redemption. The Sufi said that there is divine love hidden in the folds of existence. There was a lot of noise in the air, and incense smoke curled between languages. There were times when faiths didn't agree. At other times, they just came together. It was in places like Buddhism spread from India to Central Asia and China because monks who followed the same paths as traders did. Caravans brought them food, shelter, and most importantly, people to talk to. After dinner, a tired merchant might listen to a monk's story and remember it long after the spices were sold. Christian missionaries from the Middle East also used the same shelters to get to the steps. They carve crosses on the walls next to older inscriptions in Sanskrit or Persian. Some of the inscriptions that are still standing still have walls. Those marks are a silent record of theology and travel. Even the most practical travelers often left with a little bit of philosophy. It was what the road needed. Facing the emptiness of the desert was like facing God. And so, as they bought and sold, men started to wonder what their journeys meant. What if the road was the teacher and each stop was a lesson? The caravanai, despite all the noise, became a place of quiet change. Not just goods, but also gods were traded, changed, and carried here. Onward. Faith became a traveler too, under the arches of its vaded arches. She wore the dust of many lands and spoke the language of many hearts. People often think of the Silk Road as a place where men traded and lived, but women were its quiet builders, unseen but necessary. A network of wives, daughters, and innkeepers kept trade going when the men were away, which is what made every caravan successful. In the caravans, where tired people met people who were waiting, women changed the pace of the road as much as gold or silk always did. Some of them were merchants in their own right. Women in Central Asia, especially those from Turk and Mongol tribes, ran trade caravans, owned inns, and made deals with travelers. A skilled trader's wife, might sit cross legged in a shaded corner of a caravanserai courtyard, arguing fiercely over a roll of brocade or a bag of saffron. They got their power from their reputation, and in a world with no borders, word of mouth spread quickly. Some people worked in the inns themselves as cooks, hostesses, or keepers of the stables, making sure that every traveler, no matter how rich or poor, had a place to eat and sleep. After that, there were musicians, dancers, and storytellers, women whose songs could be heard in the courtyards after dark. Their performances were like prayers and payments at the same time. They calmed the tired, charmed the lonely, and shared bits of faraway cultures. A dancer from Samarand might wear Indian jewelry, do Persian steps, and sing Arabic verses. Her art would be as fluid as the road itself. They didn't just trade cultures, stuff. They traded beauty, rhythm, and stories. Even women of high status were able to join the network. As acts of faith and kindness, royal wives and princesses from Persia or Mongolia paid for caravans to make sure that travelers, including monks and pilgrims, had safe places to stay. Some of these inns had their names on them, and their legacies were carved into stone lintels that caravans used to pass under. But the road was also risky. Women faced much more than just being tired or hungry, like bandits, being taken advantage of, or the slow eraser of their tails. But they were incredibly strong. They changed, traded, entertained, prayed, and put up with things, becoming a part of the life of the Silk Road. Without them, the caravans would have been just stones. Women filled it with warmth, laughter, and words. Who turned cold walls into homes and made the journey into a living story that still hums beneath the dust of the old road. Every caravanserai was built to last, but they were also surprisingly beautiful to thee. For the traveler, the walls were a safe place. To the builder, they were gifts to God and guests, and they showed that he was doing his duty. The architecture of these inns showed not only where they were located, but also how they thought. For example, Anatolia's honey-cold stone hands, Persia's sun-baked courtyards, and China's timbered way stations. Each one spoke in its own way about arches and domes. Stranger, you are safe here. The typical design followed a pattern that had been honed over hundreds of years. There was only one big gate that faced the road, often carved with lines that ask for blessings for travelers. Once inside, there was a big rectangular courtyard with rows of vaulted rooms on each side. There were camels, donkeys, and horses in the lower rooms. The upper ones were home to traders and pilgrims. A fountain or well in the middle sparkled in the open air, quenching both thirst and spirit. Water was holy, so it flowed through channels and basins, cooling the air as traders opened their treasures. Some caravan rays surrounded their courtyards in colder areas, with domed roofs that had narrow skylights in them. Thick mud brick walls kept the inside cool during the day and warm at night in the desert. Builders knew how to make things work with the weather, which is something that modern architects still admire. A lot of caravans even had small mosques or shrines in their corners where people of all faiths could pray. After all, hospitality wasn't just being nice, it was against the law. The decoration told a different story. Carvings in stucco, turquoise tiles, calligraphy, and the walls were covered in geometric patterns, evidence that beauty was important, even in faraway deserts. A Persian caravan's sarai might have Quranic inscriptions about being generous, while a Central Asian caravan's sarai might have stylized lions and suns, which are symbols of protection. These designs spoke to people from different cultures and expressed one universal truth: a shared respect for the traveler's journey. But maybe the best art was the feeling of getting there, which was invisible. After days of heat, hunger, and not knowing what would happen next, it felt great to step into the cool. It was like stepping into civilization itself when you walked into the shade of a caravanserai. It was more than just a building, it was a vow. People who didn't know each other became guests, and tired men became part of something big and connected. The buildings were made of stone, but the message was human. There would always be room for you, even in the worst places. The Silk Road was a thread of trade, faith, and friendship that ran across half the world for almost 2,000 years. But even the strongest silk phrase fades over time. In the 15th century, the same caravans that used to be full of laughter and languages began to be quiet. The wind and the occasional traveler who didn't believe the world had moved on were the only sounds in their courtyards, which used to be full of camels and spice carts. The sea was the first to hit. When European explorers found sea routes to India and China, the roads across land became slower, riskier, and less profitable all of a sudden. A ship could carry 100 times as much cargo as a caravan, and no sandstorm ever ate it. A galleon. Merchants who used to cross Persia and Central Asia now sailed around Africa, trading silk for silver in busy ports instead of the empty deserts. The caravan arose, built to protect against thieves and thirst, but it couldn't stop itself from becoming old. Then the war started. The Mongol peace that used to keep traders safe was replaced by broken kingdoms and tribes that raided. Empires came and went faster than merchants could redraw their maps. Taxes went up, roads became dangerous, and many inns were left empty and abandoned, fall apart after hundreds of years of sand. The people who lived through it turned into villages, prisons, or ruins where shepherds and ghosts lived. The Silk Road's arteries dried up, and the caravan, which was the heart, stopped beating. But decline didn't mean going away. There are still signs of the past in the quiet courtyards of these ruins. Faded writing in Arabic and Persian talks about hospitality and protection from God. The burn marks on the stone remind us of the fires that once kept travelers from 12 kingdoms warm. Even now, people who are lost and visit. These pieces feel strangely familiar. The sound of footsteps, the smell of spices, and the soft murmur of traders counting coins by lamplight. The caravanserais may have died, but their legacy lives on in new ways. The silk roads may have settled, but the spirit of exchange and the desire to connect across distance live on in the roadside inns of Europe, the chaos of the Ottoman Empire, and the modern hotels that still promise comfort to strangers. The world learned from its fall that the stories that roads carry never end, even when the roads do. The caravan's eyes of the Silk Road are like the bones of a giant that has been forgotten. They are quiet, weathered, and half buried in sand. Their walls fall down, but their memory lives on in the DNA of our modern world. These old places of exchange are the ancestors of every airport lounge, roadside motel, and border cafe. They were the first global network, not of wires or code, but of people, and in their courtyards, the world first. Learned how to get in touch. You can feel it if you step into one of these ruins today, maybe in the dusty plains of Uzbekistan or the red hills of Iran. That strange beat of history. You can almost hear the faint jangle of camel bells, smell the sweat and cardamom, and hear the ghostly laughter of merchants from places that no longer exist. The stone may be broken, but the idea of hospitality and curiosity that has been around for a long time is still strong. It wasn't armies that brought civilization to the world. It was travelers who ate with people they didn't know. Archaeologists today call the caravanserai an example of globalization in action. But it was much more personal than that. It was the first chat room for people, the first international market, and the first peace treaty signed out of necessity. Under the same roof of survival, differences faded away. Here, cultures clashed not with swords, but with words. The Silk Road became more than just a way to trade. It turned into a place to learn how to care. Today, governments dream of bringing the Silk Road back to life with roads and railways. But the most real revival is spiritual, in the realization that civilizations were built on connection, not conquest. The lesson from the caravans is both simple and timeless, that the person who knocks on your door may have more than just goods. They could hold the future. The old arches' shadows stretch long across the sand as the sun sets over the ruins. It looks like they are reaching for travelers who will never come back. But in a way, we are all still on that road. Every message sent, every trip taken, every trade made across oceans and screens. The Silk Road never really went away. It just took on a new shape. Every welcome, every exchange, and every shared fire between strangers under the same eternal sky is a reminder of the caravan Sarai lives on. In the summer of 1325, a 21-year-old law student from Tangier packed his bags, got on his horse, and rode east by himself. His full name was Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Battuta. He said he was going to Mecca to finish the pilgrimage that every Muslim must make at least once in their life. At least once in your life. But what started as a religious duty would turn into the most amazing trip in the medieval world. One that would take him through China, India, Persia, Arabia, and Africa. He would travel more than 75,000 miles over the course of almost 30 years, which no other explorer had ever done before him. Ibn Battuta lived in a huge world that was connected by the golden threads of Islamic trade routes and hospitality. An invisible line runs from Morocco's Atlantic coast to the middle of Central Asia, a network of inns, scholars, mosques, and markets welcomed anyone who said Assalamu alaikum as a greeting. The faith that brought this world together gave him shelter, safety, and often chances wherever he went. Ibn Battuta was the son of a family of judges. He could read, write, and argue the law, which would help him in many ways. His first stop was Mecca, but he later wrote, I set out alone, without a companion or a caravan, because God put the love of travel in my heart. He traveled with merchant caravans across North Africa, where he had to deal with thirst and illness and barely escaped Bedouin raids. But every hard thing took him farther from home and deeper into history. He had already crossed kingdoms and deserts by the time he got to Cairo, and something had changed. The pilgrimage was no longer enough. The world itself was his calling. He was amazed by the city of Cairo, which never slept, a place where scholars argued, markets roared, and mosques shone like castles. Ibn Battuta's curiosity led him here.